I hope you're having a great day. Today in ancient church history, we look at John Chrysostom, John the Golden Mouth. He was the great preacher first in Antioch in Syria, where people were first called Christians, and then at the heart of the eastern part of the empire in Constantinople, where he preached as bishop in the great Hagia Sophia Cathedral. John Chrysostom is quite a remarkable figure in the early church. He is, hands down, viewed as the greatest preacher in the early church. Yes, there were some other great preachers, like Augustine, for example, but John Chrysostom has the reputation as the greatest preacher, certainly in Greek, and probably in both Latin and Greek. Although Latin was a language with which he did not have much familiarity, just like as Augustine himself never learned his Greek well. But it was only 150 years after his death that John Chrysostom was given this title, golden-mouthed. Chrysostom is the Greek for golden-mouthed. He was the golden-mouthed preacher first in Antioch and then in Constantinople. During his lifetime, he was actually called the golden lyre of the Holy Spirit. Well, that is a beautiful figure, isn't it? I think in English we would be tempted to talk about him as silver-tongued instead, but it would mean the same thing, and you can see how, well, it's nicer to call him golden mouth since gold is a more precious metal than silver. Today, John Chrysostom is remembered for a number of reasons. One, he is remembered as a liturgist. He is also remembered as the great preacher that he was. He was trained in the best schools of his day, the best oratorical schools. He had a famous professor named Libanius, who was a pagan rhetorician, famous in his time and in fact a friend of emperors, especially Julian the Apostate. John Chrysostom is remembered for his sermons, which were widely read in the early and medieval church, and at the time of the Reformation, people like John Calvin played a role in their publication. He is, though, also famous as a martyr, since he died on a forced march during his second exile. He was persecuted by the emperor and the empress, especially. He came to be at odds with the beautiful empress. He would die on a forced march during his second exile because the emperor wanted him farther away. He had already been exiled to a town in Armenia, but now he would be sent off to a place far off, more than 1,000 kilometers from Constantinople, so that he'd be isolated from his supporters, both in Syria and in Constantinople. John the Golden Mouth lived from 349 AD to 407 AD. So he was in the latter part of the 4th century. He was a contemporary of Augustine of Hippo and Jerome, the translator of the Vulgate. His reputation as a preacher developed when he was a priest in Antioch in Syria. And then later on, he would be suddenly called up to Constantinople, where his bold and prophetic preaching would play a partial role in alienating him from the rich and powerful and from the empress. Let's begin by talking about the birth and childhood of John, since isn't the child the father of the man, as a biographer has said? John was born in Antioch of Syria around the year 349 AD. Antioch was a remarkable city by this time. Of course, they had had a large Christian community there already for centuries. This is the town, remember, where Christians were first called Christians. There had been great battles within the context of Antioch over the doctrine of the Trinity. And during this period of time, semi-Arians were often on the upsurge, and supporters of Nicene Trinitarian thought could actually end up in exile or be deposed. So it was a place of great religious conflict. But it was a gorgeous city. It was one of the leading cities in the Roman Empire. It was wealthy. It was beautiful. Chrysostom would spend almost 50 years of his life in this magnificent city where his dazzling rhetorical skills would establish his reputation. The reason why he was such a great preacher, I think, is twofold. One is that thankfully he held to a sane approach to biblical interpretation. And then secondly, he had a profound ability to communicate in Attic quality Greek, in classical Greek. The boy was born into a family that was comfortably well off. His dad's name was Secundus. Now, we are not told by the sources whether or not Secundus was a confessing Christian or not. We'll see that John's mother certainly was, but what we do know is that Secundus was a secretary in the civil service. So he held to a very important job, a high-class civil service job in the bureaucracy. His mom also came from a wealthy background, and we know that because John later tells us that she was able to use money from her own dowry to fund his education, and therefore she didn't need to squander her husband's possessions and what he had brought into the marriage. Unfortunately for the newborn little boy, his dad passed away soon after he was born. Now that's striking, as often we read in church history about mothers dying soon after childbirth. Here, the father dies after the birth of his son John. John's mother's name was Anthusa, and she was one of the heroic Christian women and mothers of this era. She is on par with Monica, who is the famous mother of Augustine. Anthusa was a pious Christian woman who never married after the loss of her husband, even though she was left a widow at age 20. And this widow sought the best for her son. I'm reminded of how Monica probably supported her son Augustine getting a good, solid education, something that Patricius, Augustine's dad, certainly pushed for. Even though this would lead to Augustine being influenced by pagan thought and Manichaean thought. But Patricius and Monica both wanted their son to receive a good education, even though, unfortunately, it might mean that pagans were professors. Anthusa, also a pious Christian, wanted her son to receive a first-rate education in the best rhetorical tradition of Hellenistic culture. And because of that, she was willing to spend the money from her dowry. In fact, John tells us that his mother had complained about the challenges of being left with an infant son as a widow. She thought it would have been better to be left with an infant daughter because it was far less expensive to pay the dowry for a daughter than to support the expensive education of a son if you wanted to give him a first-class classical education, which she did. So she was very sacrificial and spent good money so that her son could go to school. As a little boy, John attended a version of elementary school around the age of 7 where he learned the basics, reading, writing, and arithmetic. He then attended grammar school between the ages of 10 and 15. And here already he was becoming grounded in classic Hellenistic literature. He read Homer and Demosthenes and others. And then at age 15, he began to study rhetoric. Now, at age 15, he began what we would call high school, but back in those days, it was sort of a mixture of high school and our college today. At a young age, they had high expectations for teenagers. His education from age 15 on focused on writing in good Greek and learning how to speak with Attic quality Greek. He began this type of education with the famous Libanius at age 15, and it actually would be decades before he would open his mouth as a preacher, astounding his hearers by the clarity and simplicity and perfection of his Greek rhetoric. So in his late teenage years, he began to study with a famous rhetor named Libanius. Libanius lived from 314 to 393 AD, and he possessed the official chair of rhetoric in the city of Antioch. He held this office from 354 AD to 393 AD. He was a pagan, and therefore he celebrated the rise of Julian the Apostate. Julian the Apostate was an emperor who tried to turn back the clock. He wanted to bring the empire back to its pagan past, and therefore he did everything he could to try to undermine Christianity. But then Libanius was devastated when his friend Julian died only a few years into his reign. When John was a teenager, Julian the Apostate came to power, and he reigned from 361 to 363 AD. Therefore, when John was aged 14, he would have heard Christians in Antioch celebrating and saying, "God and his Christ have triumphed," when they heard about the death of the emperor. In fact, Julian famously is supposed to have muttered on his deathbed that the Nazarene, that is Jesus of Nazareth, had conquered him. Following that time, a semi-Arian emperor came to power, which meant problems for the Nicene Christians in Antioch. At school, John did not study Latin, although he would have picked up some Latin through his exposure to it, but his education was mainly focused on studying the classical Greek writers and learning how to speak and write with the elegance of a Homer or a Demosthenes. John's mother had never remarried because, like many Christians of her age, she thought it was more pious to remain single if one's husband passed away. It was almost a form of asceticism. The fact that Christian women would remain single and unmarried for 20 years after the death of a husband astonished Libanius. One time, John's professor learned that John's mom was 40 years of age and had been a widow for 20 years. He turned to the people around him and he said, "Great heavens, what remarkable women are to be found among the Christians." Anthusa's concern to get the best education for her son therefore culminated with John studying the Greek classics and classical Greek grammar under Libanius. Libanius later told people that he wished that John Chrysostom could have been his successor as rhetor. But then he claimed that the Christians had stolen John from him. Now that actually was inaccurate. It is true that for a time, John tells us that as a teenager, he lived kind of a worldly lifestyle. But he never abandoned his Christian faith. He grew up as a Christian, and he retained his Christian confession while studying under Libanius. Although it is true that towards the end of his education, when he was around 19 or 20 years old, suddenly he begins to take the Christian faith into which he was born and raised far more serious than before. And when he reached the age of 20, he sought Christian baptism and he began to embrace asceticism. He became very serious about self-denial and living for Christ in the way he thought that should be done. Now, John was a man of his time, and unfortunately, he put off his baptism, and his mother hadn't had him baptized until he was finished with his education and approaching 20 years of age. I'm reminded how among the Amish in America, for example, the teenagers are basically allowed to sow their wild oats, and it's almost okay for them to do that. But then there comes a point where they need to make a choice, whether to stay with the Amish community or not. Well, John, at age 20, made his public profession of faith, was baptized on Easter of 368 AD. Now, since he had grown up in church, he wasn't treated like a catechumen. Now, if you had been a pagan and were converted for a 2-year period, you would have been a catechumen, and you had been trained and discipled and prepared for your public profession of faith on an Easter Sunday. But it was a sad fact that a bad theology of baptism had led many Christians in those days to put off baptism until they felt like they had sowed their wild oats. And that was in the past. They thought that baptism washed away all sins committed up until that time in original sin, and therefore they thought it was wise to delay baptism until you had committed yourself to, more holy lifestyle. So it was that in 368, the 19-year-old boy submitted to baptism and publicly professed his faith. Now, his mother would have been happy about that, but she wasn't so happy about something else. He kept talking about how he wanted to embrace a monastic lifestyle. Now, that wasn't so surprising. If you'd lived in the early church at that time, you might have thought that in order to be a truly dedicated Christian, you needed to withdraw from the world and the very, very imperfect church. After all, the church had been filled with a lot of just professing Christians who weren't very godly due to the fact that Constantine converted to Christianity, and it became very politically acceptable to be a Christian, even in positions of high power. And so Anthusa, this mother who had denied herself so much for her son, was not pleased when her son began to talk about committing himself long-term to a monastic lifestyle, because that meant him abandoning his relationship with his mother. Remember how centuries later, Hans Luther would be furious at Martin Luther for suddenly deciding that he was going to abandon the world, his dad and mom, and hole himself up in a monastery. His dad recognized that Luther wasn't showing love for his dad and mom. Kind of like in Jesus' time, there were these Jews who said, oh, yes, we have money that we could give to support our dad and mom, but we're going to say it's Corban. It's donated to God, and therefore, dad and mom, we don't have to support you anymore. We're doing something more holy. We're giving the money to God. Well, this was not an act of love on the part of a son who should have been very grateful for such a godly mother. And he wanted to live an ascetic lifestyle. He didn't want to marry, just like Hans Luther got mad at Martin Luther for the fact that he wouldn't have any grandchildren. And also, our young man begins to wear the rough clothing of a monk. He starts to avoid high-quality food, no meat for him. He's not going to drink wine. And he's given himself to the study of Scripture and prayer. Meanwhile, the leadership in the church in Antioch, of which he was a part, recognized the gifts of this young man and his maturity, and they wanted to ordain him to church office. And at age 23, he did allow himself to be ordained as a lector or reader. That meant that he could read the Bible in church and assist the deacons and priests in various ways. It's very interesting to see this young man and his relationships with his friends. He was influenced by friends, and he also had a strong influence on his friends when it came to what their vocation would be. John had one close friend whose name was Basel. He would become the famous theologian Basel the Great. As a young man, Basel had a deeper sense of a call to the ministry than John did. He also had more spiritual maturity than John. He was more advanced in his commitment to asceticism. While John would still go and attend the theater, Basel wouldn't do such worldly things. He would just want to read good theological books or the Bible. Now, meantime, John's mother had given her son the education he had received in the hope that he could serve in one of the secretariats of the imperial government. That had been her plan for her son. The secretariat drafted legislation and they wrote official documents. And a person needed to have a first-class education to be part of the civil service because the government wanted new laws or statements by the government to be presented in high quality and clear Greek. But just like Martin Luther did not end up as a lawyer, John did not end up in government service because he underwent a spiritual transformation. I don't know that he was actually converted, but what happens is he begins to take his Christian faith seriously, and he becomes converted to an ascetic theology. He also, along the way, becomes very unhappy with the empty oratory and rhetoric that he was studying in school. And the young man, just like young men today who are suddenly called by Christ to the ministry, fell in love with the Bible. He couldn't stop reading it. He couldn't stop meditating on it. And he and his friend Basel decided that they would abandon the world and pursue the religious life. They would follow the divine philosophy. And yet John wavered. And then they made plans that they would leave their homes and then they'd live together in a monastic living arrangement. But Anthusa resisted her son's plans to pursue a full-time monastic vocation. She tearfully reproached her son. And she basically said, "Are you going to leave me a widow twice?" She had lost her first man, the first man in her life, her husband. And she didn't want to lose the other man in her life, her son. And so she was angered and hurt by his lack of filial obedience and love. And so she beseeched him not to do that. She said it'd be one thing if you took up a monastic vocation after I was dead. And the mother did have an impact on her son, although he did yet engage in monastic withdrawal for a period of 6 years. Now, John actually ended up leaving town and joining the hermits in the mountains around Antioch when he ruined his reputation in a matter concerning ordination to the priesthood. Now, we'll come to that in a few minutes. So one of the friends that John had was Basel. Another friend he had was a man named Theodore, who was also his same age. Now, I think of how Augustine had such a great gift for friendship, and he had such a big impact on his friends. In fact, he was able to talk his friends into joining him in living almost in a monastic community in Hippo. And even prior to that, there was talk about having really something that was like a monastic lifestyle where Augustine and his friends could study Christianity without being in the world. John was able to impact the life of his friend Theodore, who at age 20 was divided in his mind about whether to marry and live in the world or to become an ascetic or a member of the clergy. And then Theodore's parents probably were arranging a marriage for him with his approval. And John learned that his friend was seeking marriage. He wrote a long letter to him that has come down to us, in which he argued, and this could be typical of what ascetics did in the early church. He argued, well, marriage was a legitimate institution, but he said, but for his friend, it would be an act of adultery because he had already joined himself to the heavenly bridegroom through a vow he might have made when he was part of a group of young men who were studying the scriptures together under a biblical teacher. Well, the result was that Theodore backed away from the marriage. He bought into the arguments of his friend, and he later viewed the fact that he almost had married a woman as being a seduction of the evil one from which he had barely escaped. Theodore and Basel and John, all they wanted to be athletes for Christ. They thought if you're going to truly live the Christian life, it needed to be one of radical self-denial. During this period of time, Meletius, the bishop of Antioch, took the young John under his wing. And for 3 years, he functioned as a lector. That was the lowest rank among the clergy. From there, the step up would be to be a subdeacon, a deacon, a priest, and then a bishop. At this time, 2 incidents stand out. One incident is one that impressed John about God's providential protection and the need for it. What happened is that John was walking with one of his friends one day, and they're walking along a river, and they saw this piece of paper, something white, like a book or manuscript floating down the river, and so they got it out of the water, and they were taking a look at it. And when they began reading, they realized that it was a book of magic, or part of a book on magic. Now that scared the boys terribly, because right at the same time, the emperor had learned that some people were trying to use omens or magic to figure out when he would die. Well, that was perceived as a threat to the emperor. And so he had said that anybody who was caught with a magic book would receive the death penalty. So there the 2 boys are standing with this book in their hands. And all of a sudden, they see a soldier walking towards them. They hid the manuscript, and the soldier passed by. Well, as soon as the soldier was out of sight, they quickly threw the manuscript back in the river, and they felt like they had escaped death. The second incident at this time is more damning to John's reputation as a young man. He lied and acted deceptively with respect to his dear friend Basel. He betrayed the man. Later on, he would still defend his deception with all the casuistry of a Jesuit. You see, John and his friend Basel discovered that the church authorities in Antioch planned to grab them and ordain them against their wills. You see, that was the custom in the early church. That's why Augustine thought it was safe for him to visit Hippo Regius, because they already had a bishop. What he didn't take into consideration is that the bishop was older, and with the bishop's support, the people in the congregation grabbed him and, really against his will, forced him to become their second bishop. And so what happened is that these two young men in Antioch realized that the church plans on ordaining them as priests, as preachers against their will. Well, the two young men decided that they would either reject this together or they would agree to be ordained as preachers together. They're going to be like the two musketeers, right? They're going to either stand together or together say no. Well, what happened is that John and Basel both agreed that they would, in fact, submit to ordination. So what happened is that first, Basel did submit to his ordination, but then John betrayed him. Can you imagine Basel's feeling when he discovered that his friend John had deceived him? John laughed to his face. He thought it was the greatest joke in the world. He claimed that he had shown prudent management rather than being deceitful. He had avoided ordination while his friend, who had the qualifications to be a minister, was now stuck as a priest. And later on in life, John still tried to claim that one could have good purposes in using deception, especially if one was trying to bring about some greater good. And he had all kinds of examples of that, and he thought that this fit that. But when his deception of his friend and his unwillingness to be ordained became known around Antioch, he had damaged his reputation among the Christians there. And that apparently played a role in his decision to quit Antioch and to try to maybe get his reputation back by living among the spirituals, the hermits in the mountains around Antioch. But what strikes us from his early years is the piety of his mother, the high quality of his classical education, and the fact that as a young man, he suddenly is very serious about spiritual things. He was able to study under some Bible teachers in Antioch who taught a correct approach to biblical interpretation. That is, that you should interpret the scriptures in their literal or their plain sense and not engage in allegorical exegesis. As a young man, he would also have the chance to experience living a monastic lifestyle and would give himself to even the life of a hermit. Now, once he is back in Antioch, it is true that he is back in a large city, but you can't take the monk out of John. John continues to live an ascetic lifestyle, as he will do for the rest of his life. Next time, we will look at the young man as he is maturing in Antioch and what happens when he is called to preach his first sermon.